Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Pre-Accident Podcast. I'm Todd Conklin, your host for today's podcasting adventure in system safety, safety differently, new view, human performance, blah, 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 blah. Hey, I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for listening. It's fun to hang out with you, as always. The numbers are looking crazy, so keep telling people about the podcast. I hope you find it helpful. I certainly learn every time I do one. I can't imagine you don't. The last couple have been really interesting. I like the fact that we're stepping out. Great week here. It's coming to the end of August, and so things are slowing down in the old Santa Fe Ranch where I hang my little hat. Lots of projects a little closer to home, so that's been good. Gosh, I don't know what to say other than I'm really proud of the work you're doing, and I'm really proud of the improvement. And we're getting some chances to get together and talk about it, and we'll talk more about that. I think that's going to be a big part of our discussion as well. Gosh, where else should I go in my conversation before I introduce today's podcaster? Because today's podcaster is pretty exciting. Heck, I'll just go into today. So we're going to talk to Rob Fisher, and if you don't know Rob Fisher, I don't even know where to start. I met Rob, gosh, almost 20 years ago in the DOE, and Rob comes out of the Navy, out of Power. He's worked all over the world. Rob probably has the best handle on new view and actually task-related work control that I've ever seen. I'm afraid I sound a little pandery in the podcast. It's not fake. I'm just stunned at every time I hear Rob speak. Every single time I take away nuggets of just amazing information. And he's a good friend. He's a wonderful guy, and he's super smart. And he's very generous with that knowledge and is in it for the right reasons, that's for sure. He works with a company he founded called Fisher Improvement Technologies, FIT. He'll talk a little bit about that and about something he calls eChip, which I'll let him explain both those in more detail. I think you're going to find Rob's podcast to be very, very educational. For those of you that are not, down the technical side of this equation, I even think you'll like it. Rob's taught for years, and so there's some of those conversations that we have. I just think you're going to really like where Rob is. It's a great roundabout conversation that goes in good places. That, my friends, is worth listening to for sure. So without much more ado, let's get started because I want to get into this one so we can have some time on the back end to talk about what we learned. So here it is, my friends. Without any further ado, this is Rob Fisher.
Listen, I am so glad you found it now.
Are you excited now? Are you still excited?
I'm so nervous, excited.
So, Rob, I've wanted you on this podcast almost since the day the podcast began. That's how long I've wanted you. And we've worked diligently to get schedules to collide, and they did. And so that's really good. And this conversation, I think, will be one of the best ones we have because if I think about people doing this work, I can't not think about you as a super early leader in the applied side of this safety differently. And so one of the things we ought to do, because I'm dying to ask you this question, is let's start big and then come back to small. What are you thinking about? When you look at human performance, what are you thinking about next?
Well, what I'm thinking about next is that organizations need to look at human performance not from the element that says, I need those people to make fewer errors, and if they make fewer errors, then everything will be better and we'll be safer. They need to look at human performance more holistically. So if I look at big picture, the big picture says, if I wanted to tie it to safety, that if an organization doesn't have the safety outcomes that they want, then probably there are some physical elements there, some performance elements there, some cultural elements there. We kind of call human performance in the next generation the great enabler. It's not just about the individuals. If we understand human performance, the future of human performance, it's about the behaviors of senior leaders and what those behaviors do, and then managers, and then supervisors, and then workers, and how all of those behaviors then come together to create or start moving a culture. The human performance isn't about whether you have or don't have a culture now. It's what behaviors do you need to change to get where you want to go. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, totally. In fact, one of the things I think you said that's pretty profound, we ought to hit on pretty early, is that it's all of these people together. So it's leaders and what leaders do, managers and what managers do, supervisors and what supervisors do, and workers and what workers do. All of those things together really provide this total picture. Because one of the things I struggle with is, and I see this all the time, and you must too, when you go into a company and you hear language that kind of says it's their problem. So the leaders will kind of say, those guys need to be better at whatever, they need to fix whatever. And that's really a challenge for me. How'd you get started in all this?
Well, I had the background in nuclear power and was at a plant that got in trouble. And I was just one of the people that got chosen to help get them out of trouble. And at that point, they said that we had human performance problems, but this is the late 80s, early 90s. Nobody knew what that was. I mean, the only book on it was James Reason had Human Error out. And we would read that and then go try and figure out how to make that work at the hands of a mechanic, or make that work at the hands of an operator. And I guess I got good at that piece from my operations background, and they started sending me around the country to help other people do the practical application side. And the key to the way I always approach the science of human performance was to not deviate from the science of human performance. In other words, you have to ground the practical application in the science, not what makes people feel good, not what makes managers want to do things, but what the science says will probably be the outcome, and then how do I make that practically applicable? So several of the tools that we came up with in those early days and several of the tools we used have actually evolved over time. You still see companies trying to go back to the old version of those tools. The reality is that kind of got people on the road, but now we know what made those tools work, and we're teaching people better ways to do that at all of those levels in the organization you talked about. A classic example is if you go into a company, let's take a plant, for instance. If you can get a couple of behavior changes in the senior leadership of that plant, I got a phone call today from a plant manager that said they had started talking about a few of the elements that we talked about for 4 hours 2 weeks ago. And the phraseology from the people in the field started changing immediately, and not a one of them has human performance training yet. But everything those leaders looked at is now being looked at from that human performance systemic lens. So early on, I kind of created this human performance system of people, programs, processes, work environment, organization, equipment, and how all of those impact each other. They all impact the individual, and the individual impacts all of those things. And if you frame your understanding of that human performance system in those 4 areas, senior leadership, managers, supervisors, and workers, then everyone at that level can start doing something immediately to start changing those behaviors we were talking about.
Who do you think has to change the most? He asked wonderingly.
Well, I think that changes in senior leadership and managers are the most and the hardest, and mostly because I don't think that we teach senior leaders and managers the real impact they have on the work in the field, the positive impact and the negative impact that they have. I don't think that's taught well in leadership.
I agree with you completely.
And when those folks change what they look at, what they say, and what they do, the changes in the people that follow them are almost immediate.
How do you get them to open up to these new ideas and these new thoughts? Because it can be a direct threat to them in a way.
It could be, and I've seen it approached that way. It's just not the approach that I take. We're very conversational, and then in the end, we do a 4-hour senior leader meeting. And it's kind of a decision-making meeting. Is this human performance and system a way that we want to go? Is it our next logical step in whatever it is we want as an outcome? Or is that not a direction we want to go? We think our next logical step is someplace else. So rather than trying to eat the whole elephant, you introduce them to a new set of concepts and give them a few tools that they can try, and then we institute something called soak time. So after about 4 hours with the senior leaders, they get to soak on that for a while without the pressure of the organization to be good at it. And we give them a couple of tools to try. We give them a deviation analysis to try. We give them some definitions we want them to use. And then we just ask them to use their pocket guides when they have discussions with each other, so they're not trying to remember everything. And they can hold each other accountable. And rather than it being something that has conflict in it, what I see mostly is it's not joking, but it's more of a sense of humor associated with looking at things the old way. If somebody brings up the bad apple theory, whether they call it that or not, then somebody else in the organization pulls out their little pocket guide and says, isn't this what we were supposed to be saying? So it's not, I tell them, I'm leaving in 4 hours. If you want your organization to go a different direction, you are going to have to hold each other accountable for going that new direction. And in some organizations, Todd, it's the first time they've ever had to hold each other accountable for almost anything.
Oh, I know. It's remarkable when they start checking each other, because that shift in thinking isn't hard. And I always think, and check me if I'm wrong on this, Rob, but for the most part, the senior leaders I work with are really good people, and they want the right things. So it's not like they're evil geniuses we're trying to turn to the bright side. They just haven't had the experience and nobody's talked to them about facilitating this kind of new view change. And that's where I think the work you do is remarkable. Now, people may not know, although I'll be shocked if people don't know you, but they may not know that what you do better than anybody well, there's several things you do better than anybody in the world, but what you do better than probably anybody in the world is really look at how work is done, the applied side, sort of the operator end of the work configuration. And what's crazy about that is you do it with an amazing amount of empirical discipline. So you never let go of the science, the hardcore theory, but you talk about application all the time. And in many ways, Rob, you're filling a hole that other people haven't filled. How'd you get there?
Well, first of all, thank you for that compliment. I'm very humbled by that.
Well, when you beg people to be on the podcast, you got to be nice. You can't be mean.
I didn't beg you to be on the podcast.
No, I begged you. I begged you.
I think I got there, Todd, because that's where my roots were. I spent 10 years in the Navy. I spent 7 or 8 years in the field as an operator, and I kind of operated across the whole spectrum: operations, maintenance, switching. And to me, those were the people in the early days of human performance. They were the reason why I was there, because there was no senior leaders need to understand and all of this other stuff back then. Back then, it was something we gave to the workers to be better at what they did. Human performance started as a final barrier improvement system. And I migrated it backwards from there. Because, you and I have talked a lot about cause and effect and what companies do or don't do that either enable or do not enable the performance that they want. And I was constantly looking from that operator, mechanic, engineer perspective at what those, we now call them systemic drivers. In other words, what in the people, programs, processes, work environment, organization, equipment would drive that individual to do what they did at the time they did it and have it make sense to them at the time, as Sidney would say.
Right. Local rationale. Yes, sir.
Right. I was constantly looking at it from that perspective, so I had to balance both pieces, not just the hand on the switch, the hand on the valve, or the piece of equipment, or the scaffolding, or the throttle, but what in that system drove that individual to do what they did and have it make sense to them at the time. In doing that, I didn't have the background to leave the science because I didn't think anybody would believe me. I didn't think anybody would believe Rob. So in order for them to believe me, I had to tell them where it came from. And in order to tell them where it came from, I had to study that. And then sometimes I had to say, well, it would be better if we called knowledge-based performance mode something else. It would be better, but it wouldn't be what the science says. So it's easier for me to defend what we need to call something, as simple as that sounds, than it is to change it to something else. A lot of times people try and play with that system, put more things in it, take more things out, because people like it to change. But that system is easily controlled and managed by the individuals in the organization. That's why it works. And probably 15 years ago or so, I settled on that balance, and that's kind of where we come from all the time. And it's not practically applicable. We just don't do it.
And it's served you. I mean, it's really served. The funny thing is that it's, looking back at it with sort of the benefit of time, it's really served the shift into the new view really effectively. For new people, for people just, early on this journey, what do you think the most important books they ought to read are? What are your recommendations for sort of ways to get into the science that is doable for a new person?
Well, I think that I tell people, if you read Sidney's Field Guide to Understanding Human Error, Decker's Field Guide to Understanding Human Error, that's probably the first book that I would have people read. We used to only have human error. The problem is that's a tough read. And
application, that's a hard book.
Bible, but it's just a hard read.
Yeah.
And nowadays, with the practical applications that we have, it's hard to tie those practical applications back to specific elements. But I tell them the two books I recommend are yours and the Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. Those are the two books that I recommend.
And digging deep like that gives them the foundation by which they can go in and sort of make things happen. How many people you think you've taught? That's an unfair question, but I'd like to ask it.
Well, I don't know how many I've taught personally, but I know that we kind of stopped counting when the folks that have done our training within companies crossed the 150,000 person mark.
Wow. And, what's that feel like to think that you've had that kind of impact really on workplaces, probably internationally, but certainly in North America? How's that? I mean, what do you think about all this?
Well, first, it's probably the most humbling thing you can ever imagine. It's not a lot, but we probably get 3 or 4 emails a week from someone in the world who either at home or at work used the concepts to avoid something severe. Not just avoiding something simple, but to avoid something severe. And I think that I never want it to be about me. It always has to be about the technology, because the technology will be sustainable where a person will not be. So when we go into an organization, I tell them up front, you're probably not going to see a lot of me, and I'm going to vary the people that you do get to see, because I don't want it to be about the individuals teaching you. I want you to learn the technology in a way that you can parlay that technology to the improvements that you need. We call it integration of the technology into the day-to-day workflow. I don't know a lot of other places that do that, but we facilitate the integration of the technology so that you're not relying on a fallible human at the end of that Swiss cheese model to have to apply a tool. You're integrating the concepts so that tool doesn't need to be applied.
Much more resilient, much more robust. How do you manage customer expectations? Aren't your clients pissed off it's not you?
Not really, because we start that from the beginning. In the senior leaders, I'll tell them, I do the senior leaders myself. But in the senior leader meetings, I tell them, this may be the last time you ever see me, but you have to understand the people we're going to send, A, are very good at this. B, at what they're doing, they're better than I am because they do a lot more of it. And C, they will be a lot more relatable than I will. You and I have talked a little bit about the way personalities impact performance. and I have a personality that may be dynamic enough to get senior leaders to look. But the folks that come in and teach have the personalities that get the managers, supervisors, and workers so they want to do. And they give them those capabilities. So seeing both the variabilities of the personalities and understanding the tendencies of those different personalities as we're working through, whether we're doing E-chip or whether we're doing FIT, doesn't matter. That we tell them up front that piece is important because their organization is going to outlive them. They're not out there on the floor telling everybody exactly what their expectations are, and they hope they enable their managers to be good at it, and we're the same way.
And absolutely. So we probably ought to define E-chip and FIT.
Oh, good. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Well, FIT is Fisher Improvement Technologies. That's the company that I own. We have about 12 people that work for us around the world, and we operate in about 17 different countries in about 10 different languages. E-chip is called E-colors in Human Performance. It's actually the next generation of understanding that human performance system that says that individual that's in the middle of that system has certain personality tendencies that are either strengths or potential limiters on their ability to manage and control that system. And if we understand those strengths and potential limiters, we can help that individual in whatever role they're in the organization better control that system. So it'll help them use tools better. It'll make sure that the right person uses the right tool the right way at the right time by a large percentage higher probability than if you just stick an individual in there and understand the generalized science of human performance. So what we say is in FIT, we bring the generalized science of human performance to practical application. What E-colors, what E-chip, E-colors in Human Performance does is it individualizes that capability at all the different levels of the organization. So we've seen senior leaders that never really understood that their personality tendencies were limiting supervisors' capability to supervise the workers and increasing error rate. And we're kind of calling E-chip the next generation of human performance because it takes that system to the next level. It individualizes that human performance system instead of just using the generalized science. But it's all framed in the generalized science of human performance.
And go ahead.
Can I give a plug?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
If you go to e-chp.net, echip.net, then you can read more about it. But that's in general, that's what E-chip does. It's our next logical move in the generalized science of human performance.
Now, are you a proponent of training everybody in the organization?
In one form or another.
Interesting. I mean, I think that's really an important thing to talk about. When you say in one form or another, what do you mean?
Well, the way we've approached human performance, the way FIT has approached it, is there's no magic mirrors, there's no smoke, and nobody gets told different information than others. Some safety systems that come in, there's variability between what people are told. In the way we approach human performance, different people at different levels of the organization use the exact same science, but they use it, they have to be taught that science in a way that they can use. So the senior leaders may be taught a very high level of the science because they're not going to have to use verbalized point and touch as a tool in the field. But the workers may get a higher involvement of the tools in their training than the managers might. And the supervisors need to be that clay layer. They need that sandwich of the practical application, what the workers need to do, how do I help manage those workers as a supervisor, and how do I communicate up and down the organization as a leader. So everyone across the organization needs it. It's about how much and how that information is parsed out, but never about what science does one get and what science does another get. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, no, it's a good answer. It's a challenge because the need to train everybody seems daunting. And what I always try to talk people down from, and you're a good person to sort of bring in this conversation, is that when we say train everybody, it's not 8 hours classroom for every single employee in the company. I mean, training is tailored sort of to where the worker is and what the worker needs. In fact, Rob, I should tell you one of my favorite companies, and just a rock star company in the human performance world. They never got around to really training their workers because they kind of didn't need to. Once they introduced the vocabulary and leaders started using it, the workers sort of got it right away. I mean, it wasn't a big switch for them.
Yes, I agree with that. Some of the challenges in high-risk industries are we may not have time to wait. In other words, the workers need something.
Yeah, I agree.
And the level of that depends on the risk. I'll give you an example.
Go ahead.
Working with a manufacturer that has a piece of high-speed processing where the workers are highly skilled and habitually do what they do 100 to 500 times a day. They need less training than somebody who would be entering confined spaces 3 times a week, and the confined spaces are different with different hazards every time.
Gotcha. Yeah, gotcha. So let's talk about a couple things that I think you're the best at in the world. One is I think your concepts around pre-job brief are untouchable. They're so good. And I think every company in the world would benefit from the way you look at pre-job briefs. How'd you get to that?
Well, something seemed like it was missing, Todd. And when I went back and looked at the research, when they were talking about performance modes and mental models and the general air modeling system, they were never talking about a job being lockout, tagout, a job being clearing a tank, a job being removing a pump. They were always talking about tasks and actions, that lower level. When I started shifting my thinking to a phrase that I kind of came up with, tasks and actions kill people, not jobs and occupations. And if we think about it that way, then I may have a job that's going to take all day, but only 2 of the steps in the task, in one of the tasks in that job, may be a critical step that could provide that significant outcome, whether it's injury to life or health or equipment. So if we look at it that way, then really I only need to do heavy, detailed briefings where I understand everything about it on the tasks that have the risk. But if I just do it at the pre-job level, the big level, by the time we get around to doing that task that has those important or critical steps, people have time to forget all those different traps, now have time to come in and impact that task, putting people more vulnerable. So we shifted to say, pre-job briefs, those are great. You need to do them. Here's what you need to do for high-risk tasks. And really it's a mindset swing that once the workers get into it, they start to pull for having pre-task briefs instead of the organization having to push doing those pre-job briefs.
And that's beautiful. And what's crazy to me, and I guess it's just crazy, is that it took us a long time for someone like you to sort of stumble into that thinking, to sort of completely shift the way we look at pre-job briefs. I mean, you've kind of changed the reason we do pre-job briefs. I mean, that it's almost a complete different outcome. And I think that's a real challenge for people.
And the way we kind of handle that challenge is we ease into it, Todd. We use a concept that we call high risk or critical task of the day. So we realize that a company is where it is, or a plant is where it is, where related to how they do pre-job briefs. Let the people tell you what their highest risk task is of the day, and then use this pre-task briefing regimen on that task. And then every now and then, send a manager out to do a value-based observation on that task. So now the organization is paying attention to what the people think are important, what the people think have hazard and risk, and they're watching that and providing lessons learned for things that have risk. And what it does, I believe this is what it does, is it actually provides a laser focus on risk that organizations have never had before.
Yeah, and one of the big nuanced differences, the what I'm sort of hitting on, is that when that manager goes out and do that observation, they're not observing worker behavior, they're observing the task, and they're looking at actual risk. And that laser focus, I think, is worth its weight in gold. I mean, that's amazing.
You're spot on, Todd. That's why we started calling them values-based observation instead of method-based observation.
Yeah.
You know, we say there's plenty of people out there watching method, and you're still going to do all of those. If you're doing behavior-based safety, you're still going to do all of those. Every now and then, managers need to go out and see, is this matching our value system?
Yeah.
And one identification of a value mismatch is worth 100 methods that had to be evaluated to see if there was a value mismatch there.
And then you've done something that I think is amazing, and that is you've given life to Rasmussen's GEMS model, knowledge, rule, skill, probably more than anybody else has. And I think that's probably entirely a function of the fact that you've thought about it a lot more than most people have. Did that model scare you at first? Let me backtrack. Were there slides when you first started teaching human performance that you taught poorly and now you teach better? That's inside baseball for everyone who's ever taught a class right there.
Yeah, let's hope so. To me, and I look back on my personal revelation, and I hate to tie it back to a single point, but my personal revelation was, if I was thinking I was in skill-based, where my error rate, whether I knew it or not, was about 1 in 1,000, I was acting like I was in skill-based, but I was thinking I was near rule-based, and I was actually in knowledge-based.
Yeah.
That error rate in knowledge-based performance mode of 1 in 2 to 1 in 10, it actually applied to me, Rob Fisher, the worker. That was my error rate. And one of the things we started doing in training was to get individuals at every level in the organization to own that error rate and to realize that they can't think their way out of that error rate. They have to do something different. In come the tools. And if they don't do anything different, they're accepting that error rate. And what we discovered was the very people that most folks thought would never take to human performance were the ones that said, if that's my error rate, I'll do something about it. That 25-year worker, that when their behavior starts to change, the newer workers follow in suit. So we just started noticing that the people that companies would say, well, that's all right, but you'll never get old Bob there to buy in. Bob was the first one to talk to you in the hall and say, you know, that's why I do this, and that's why I do that. And now they can put science behind it. Where before, if we'd have come in and told them, yeah, this is what the possibility is, and you guys will buy into that, won't you? But we couldn't tie it back to the science, then they would have never bought in. It would have slid by the wayside. Still today, from 15 years ago, we have people that remember that piece, that description. And one of the things that I tell folks, if you get that part, you can't ever take it away from somebody.
Yeah. Well, you can never unlearn something, right? I mean, that's really important.
And people don't want to unlearn that. So when we give them, we call them triggers. And one of the things that I developed to help people understand when they needed these things were the triggering mechanisms. And what we say is, if the trigger exists, then the vulnerability exists. Now it becomes your choice as to whether you avoid the vulnerability or not, once you've seen the trigger. But when we were just teaching things like traps and performance modes, we would always look backwards and say, well, they were in knowledge-based. You know, they had a high error rate. They had a lack of knowledge. Well, that's too late. We want people to understand the triggers. When you're scratching your head, when you're saying, I think, I believe, I'm pretty sure. Now with each of the new personalities, we've discovered that 25% of the personalities will never say, I think, I believe, or I'm pretty sure, because they want you to believe they're right.
Yeah.
So they'll say, absolutely, guaranteed. And when they say that, their brains told them they're vulnerable. Now they need to get their bodies to respond to that trigger. And I think that it was just my personal revelation of talking to other people that were in my situation and learning how I needed to talk to them to convince them they were vulnerable enough so that they would do something. And then again, we backed it up the chain to the senior leaders.
And gave them real handles they could grab hold of and actually make differences, both intellectually and in reality. That's pretty important. So I'll tell you something that I've learned, and then you tell me what you think. The more I do this work, the less interesting human error is.
Wow.
It's so normal. It's never causal, and it's not terribly interesting.
That is a great way to say it, Todd. And the only thing about that is, for us, we can allow it to be uninteresting because we have the big picture.
Yeah.
And to get those senior leaders and managers hooked in a way that they will create some kind of sustainable outcomes, we have to make it interesting for how that error occurred, and then it can become uninteresting to them as well.
Well, I think how the error occurred is stunningly interesting. The error itself is just it's funny. It's just not very interesting anymore. If somebody says we've had an accident, worker made a mistake, I pretty much would say, yeah, that's pretty much how accidents happen.
No kidding, Sherlock.
Yeah, I'm no genius, but yeah, okay, we got that one.
I was sharing with the senior leadership team last week. I said, have you ever seen failure to recognize risk as a cause? And they kind of looked at each other and laughed. Yeah, we see that all the time. I said, well, no kidding, Sherlock. Somebody recognized the risk. Wouldn't you think they'd have done something different?
Yeah.
What kind of morons do you think you hired?
It's funny.
So failure to recognize risk is a condition, and that condition exists because of some of those drivers. That means the error related to failure to recognize risk, to use your words, which are great, is totally uninteresting.
Just not interesting. And if you go back and listen to some of the old podcasts, that we had a theorist who is a academic. He's a organizational complexity theorist, and you should go back and listen to this because it's so reinforcing to what you're saying and to the science. Where he says, you don't manage complexity; you manage complexity conditions. And what you do is you move with complexity. There's never a point in time where complexity stops, and the conditions become really the only handle by which you can make changes. So if you had to give advice, Rob, and you're on the hook now, what would you tell a person just getting ready to take his company on this journey?
Well, I think I would tell them to read the 2 books, and then to get in touch with somebody that is willing to come talk to them, either one-on-one or a small group, and tell them about what human performance is and what it does and how it works and what their impact is, and then try some of the elements that person tells them. And if they do that, if they really try, if they do what they're told, they're going to see some change, and it'll be almost immediate. And if they don't, I can almost guarantee you they don't do what they're told.
Yeah. What pitfalls should they watch out for?
Well, the pitfalls are, there's just a couple of them. Number one, don't let the naysayers take over. We've been doing things the old way, the old theory, for a long time in industry. And we've been doing them a long time because there's a lot of people that don't like change. So don't let the people that don't like change ruin your soak time. You have to hold them accountable to the new way as much as you're holding all the rest of the people accountable to the new way. And the other piece is, don't avoid the seniorest of leaders. Everybody's got to really be on board and driving. The biggest thing that I see is the seniorest of leaders say, well, I'll support that. And the problem is, that's like DuPont saying, I'll support Jeff Gordon. Well, that doesn't help him drive the car. He needs somebody in a leadership position that is willing to be different so that they look at the new way and they hold each other accountable for that new way to move the company forward.
And that notion of holding each other accountable, is a different type of vulnerability for a senior leader. I mean, you're really asking them to almost, I hate to use this word, but it's a different kind of control. They have to let go of the old control in order to grab the new control. You can't have both at the same time. Like I tell people all the time, Rob, you can't learn and perform at the same time. You can never learn and discipline at the same time. And it's because you have to let go of the old in order to embrace the new. That's tough, though.
Yeah, and you know, the one piece of accountability that I tell them in the senior leader course is this. I'm going to give you've got your workbooks. Put your name and phone number on them so people can get them back to you if you leave them laying around. When you have a conversation with somebody, pull out your pocket guide or this workbook and have the conversation in rule-based mode. Don't have the conversation off the top of your head. You'd be amazed at how many of your people will use procedures if they see you walking around with a pocket guide in your hand. And if I came back in 4 weeks, if you haven't asked me for more pocket guides because yours are worn out from being used, it's probably not going to work for you. Go try and find something else to work between now and when you think this will work. And it's amazing that behavior of forcing them to look at the definitions and look at the science actually lets them do, and the learning happens along the way.
Nice. Did we miss anything? What didn't we cover for our first? I think we'll do another one of these, maybe a couple more. But what did we miss? Did we miss anything on this conversation?
I don't think so. I think this was a great start, Todd, because I think if people didn't get it, I'll say it at the end. It all starts with senior leadership. And for us as a company, if we can't get the senior leaders to say that they're changing what they do and changing the way they talk, we don't even bother telling them how to integrate.
I agree completely. It's the lesson the universe teaches over and over again. The senior leaders have to be they if I always say give them twice the amount of learning that you'd give a worker. So if you give a worker a 4-hour class, the leaders need an 8-hour class. Thanks for your time, man. This was amazing. You were stunning, life-changing.
Well, thank you very much, Todd. I really appreciate the opportunity. And I look forward to doing this again if we can.
Oh, I promise we can. I promise you. Thanks, Rob.
You bet, Todd.
So that's Rob Fisher, and that was quite a conversation. I hope you like it. I always am afraid I sound really pandery, but I have to tell you, I always try to look at the bright side. I'm mostly a positive person. I practice gratitude. I've talked to you about that a bunch of times. But with Rob, I'm really serious. Every time I see him present, I walk away with ideas and concepts that I just had not thought of. And so that's fun. I mean, it's a real challenge, and it's really interesting to hear him talk. And it's just fun to be with somebody who has thought as much as he's thought about human performance and safety. And he's really turned it into quite a business. I mean, he's really successful, and it's fun to be a part of that, I think. What's really fun is getting the chance to actually play that conversation to you, because I hope there's stuff in there you could take away as well. Don't underestimate the power of this pre-job briefing at a task level. It's really, really significant for a bunch of reasons. The sociology behind it's great because the workers can identify their highest risk work. It really changes up the conversation. It's new, it's novel, it's clever, and it works really well. I've had just tremendous luck with it at lots of places. Hope you enjoyed it. Hey, isn't it about time you be on the podcast? I think it is. You've got lots to say, and I would love to talk to you. Don't be scared. But until then, keep listening. Tell your friends and subscribe. That makes a huge difference. Be sure to have fun. The summer's over, and we're going into the fall period, which is a great time to be in New Mexico. You're all invited. Come on out. Learn something new every day, and for goodness sakes, be safe. There is nothing funnier than asking somebody who teaches a class 1,000,000 times if there were slides that they sucked at and got better. Remember that. Out.